All right, so I want to warn you guys that today's Ed puzzle is probably going to be a little longer than some of the other ones that we've had because we're going to talk about each organelle that's found in a eukaryotic cell. So if you remember, and you guys read this section on Friday, so you should have a little bit of background knowledge about the section. But just to kind of review a little bit, remember the two main types of cells are eukaryotic and prokaryotic cells, right? Those are the two groups of cells. And we said from the very beginning, one thing that I've hounded over and over to you about the difference between prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells is the fact that a eukaryotic cell has a nucleus and a prokaryotic cell does not, but also eukaryotic cells have membrane-bound organelles and prokaryotic cells do not. So we're going to talk more about the cell organelles that are found within the eukaryotic cell. Now, some of these will be also in a prokaryotic cell, like the plasma membrane and ribosomes. Those things will be found in both, but most of these that are membrane-bound organelles are only going to be found in eukaryotic cells. And there's also two types of eukaryotic cells. There's plant cells and animal cells, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that today as well. So let's go ahead and get started. So this here is a picture of a eukaryotic cell, and you can see here it's labeled for you. You can see that there are several different organelles that are found, and we're going to talk about each of these. So first, let's define an organelle. An organelle is a tiny membrane-covered structure inside of eukaryotic cells that perform various functions. So each organelle within the cell has a specific function. So a few examples of organelles is the nucleus, a vacuole, mitochondria, right? There are several different ones that you're going to need to familiarize yourself with, and we're going to start to do that today. So let's start with the cell membrane, or also known as the plasma membrane, right? We have already talked about this. You've done a whole section on it. You've read the section, you've watched an Ed puzzle on it, you've completed a worksheet. So I hope that you are starting to be familiar with the plasma membrane. But just to review, it's a boundary or a covering of the cell, and it controls what enters and leaves, right? That's the main function. It has other functions, of course, we've talked about those, but the big idea is that it controls what enters and leaves. And remember, that's a phospholipid bilayer. You always need to be sure that you remember the cell membrane is a phospholipid bilayer. But in this picture, you can see that there are animal cells and there are plant cells. So animal cells are found here on the left, and this is a plant cell here on the right. Notice that this plant cell has a cell wall, an animal cell does not. So the only boundary that an animal cell has is the cell membrane. The plant cell has both a cell wall and the cell membrane. So the nucleus, right? We said that this is that defining characteristic between a prokaryotic and eukaryotic cell. That was one of the questions that you had to answer for me on your reading review. It said, what would you look for when you were trying to differentiate between a prokaryotic and a eukaryotic cell? And the big thing was whether or not that it has the nucleus. So the nucleus is what contains the DNA within a eukaryotic cell. It is essentially the control center of the cell. So you may hear it referred to as the brain of the cell, and that's because it literally controls every aspect of the cell. It kind of sends out those signals just like your brain does to the rest of your body. It tells your body, to raise your hand or to take a step, whatever it may be. It's your brain that sends out those signals. Well, the same is true for the nucleus. The nucleus sends out the signals to the rest of the cell, telling it what and what not to do. So chromatin is a specific type of DNA that is uncoiled and free floating in the nucleus. Now, I don't expect you to be super familiar with the ins and outs of DNA right now. We're going to talk about that a little later in the school year. But for all intents and purposes, DNA is typically a 3D structure. It's typically coiled. And I'm sure you've seen pictures of DNA before, be it on a TV show or in a science class. They've shown examples of pictures of DNA. And so typically it's that coiled look. It kind of looks like a ladder. Well, chromatin specifically, it's still DNA, but it's uncoiled, and it's just free floating in the nucleus. Now, inside the nucleus, it's kind of like Russian nesting dolls. Inside the nucleus, you have something else called the nucleolus. So the nucleolus is found inside the nucleus, and it produces ribosomes. So you have your nucleus, right? That's the control center of the cell. Inside the nucleus is the nucleolus, and the nucleolus produces ribosomes. So here we have the nuclear envelope, or AKA the nuclear membrane. Now this is what covers the nucleus. So just like with the cell membrane, that's what allows things to enter and leave the cell, right? The same is true with the nuclear envelope. That is what allows things to enter and leave the nucleus. So if we're looking at the nucleus and we're starting from the outside and we're working our way all the way in, we start with the nuclear envelope that allows things to enter and leave. Then we have the nucleus that controls things within the cell. Then we have the nucleolus, which produces ribosomes. So you can see here, it's like this hard outer shell. That's the nuclear envelope. Then we move into the nucleus. There's that chromatin, right? That's that uncoiled DNA. And then right here, this smaller yellow ball is the nucleolus. So now we're going to talk about the cytoplasm. This is something that both prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells have in common. You may also hear it referred to as cytosol, but 99% of the time it's going to be referred to as cytoplasm, especially in my class. So be sure that you're familiar with the term cytoplasm. It is the fluid that surrounds the organelles, and it kind of fills up, or it's known as the empty space within the cell. So when you're looking at a diagram and you see, other organelles are going to be labeled. They're going to be round or oval or rectangular, right? They'll have all these different shapes, but then it'll appear just to be an empty space. Well, that empty space is the cytoplasm. That is what all of the other organelles are suspended in. And it's not just something that organelles are suspended in, it's also where many chemical reactions take place. So we'll talk more about chemical reactions within the cell later, but right now you just need to know that cytoplasm is kind of that empty space that surrounds the organelles. So here we have the cytoskeleton. It is something that provides shape and structure for the cell. So they are proteins, right? We talked about proteins when we talked about macromolecules. Proteins is one of the 4 types of macromolecules, and they provide shape and structure for the cell. So remember that, relate it to just like us as humans, right? Our skeleton is what provides the shape and structure for our bodies. The same is true for the cytoskeleton. That's what provides the shape and structure for the cell. So now we have the cell wall. Now, here's what you need to know about the cell wall. Not every eukaryotic cell has a cell wall. Remember, when we're talking about eukaryotic cells, there are plant cells and there are animal cells. Those are the 2 main types. You'll also have bacteria and fungi and protists, but the 2 main types are plant and animal. Now, animal cells do not have cell walls. They do not have cell walls. Plant cells have cell walls. Bacteria cells do, fungi cells do, and some protist cells do, but animal cells do not have cell walls. You are going to need to know that. If I give you a picture of an animal cell and a plant cell, you should be able to differentiate between the two because an animal cell does not have a cell wall. So for the cells that do have cell walls, it's the outer covering. It is the very top layer of the cell. Yes, that cell still has a cell membrane, but it is found underneath the cell wall. The cell wall also provides support, and it's made up of cellulose. So that's a carbohydrate. Remember, that's another one of the 4 macromolecules we talked about. And so that's what makes up the structure of the cell wall. So here we have the mitochondria. It produces energy, ATP, during cellular respiration. Now, right now, you are not going to need to know cellular respiration. Later on, you are going to need to know it in detail. But right now, do not focus on cellular respiration. You essentially need to know that mitochondria produces energy known as ATP. You do need to be familiar with ATP, and I think we've talked about that a little bit already, but you do need to be familiar with that. A lot of times people will refer to the mitochondria as the powerhouse of the cell, so you need to be familiar with that as well. And you can see here, so here's the picture. This gray looking image is a cell, okay? The orange is the mitochondria. So here they've brought it out and they've shown you what a mitochondria looks like. Now, what you need to know is that a lot of times a cell will have more than just one mitochondria. So where it says mitochondrion, that is the plural form of mitochondria. And you can see here that this cell specifically has 3 mitochondria. So when we pull out the mitochondria specifically, there are things found within the mitochondria as well. We have DNA. These, what look like holes on the outside, those are called porins. Inside, there are these folds. Those are the cristae. Then we have the outer membrane and the inner membrane. And then we have the intermembrane. So there are 3 types of membranes, and then there's the matrix. I don't want you to focus too much on all the specifics of the mitochondria, but you do need to know that it is a very complex organelle, and it produces energy. So produces energy known as ATP, and it is the powerhouse of the cell. That's really important that you know that as well. So moving on to the endoplasmic reticulum, you'll hear it called rough ER and smooth ER because one of those has ribosomes on it. So if it has ribosomes, it's rough, and the rough ER makes proteins. The smooth ER has no ribosomes, and those make lipids. So here we are again talking about macromolecules, proteins, and lipids. The rough ER, remember, if something's rough, it has something on it, so it has ribosomes, and that makes proteins. Smooth ER, no ribosomes, so it's a smooth surface, there's no bumps to make it seem rough, and those make lipids. Both rough ER and smooth ER transport molecules through the cell. So they act as a transportation because they're transporting those molecules that they've made through the cell. So rough ER makes proteins, transports proteins through the cell. The smooth ER makes lipids, transports lipids through the cell. And let me show you this picture really fast. Here we have the ribosome. It kind of looks like coral, like that's found in the ocean. And you can see here, all of this is considered to be the endoplasmic reticulum. The difference is this is the rough ER because notice it has these ribosomes on it. And this is known as the smooth ER because it does not have ribosomes. Okay, so remember, The ribosomes are made by the nucleolus that's found within the nucleus. So now you're probably thinking, all right, Ms. Brammer, you've said the word ribosomes 1,400 times. What is a ribosome? It is something that makes proteins. We have proven time and time again that proteins are important. And if you have not picked up on the fact that science builds, you need to. And this is why it's super important that you stay on top of your schoolwork, because now we're tying in things that we talked about in chapter 6. Okay, science builds. So you need, if you're not understanding concepts, you need to let me know, and I need to try to help you understand them better, because it's going to just continue to build. And you're going to better understand what we learn next if you first understand what we're learning now, because what we're learning now will play a role in everything else that we learn for the year. So ribosomes make proteins. Proteins was one of our 4 types of macromolecules. Remember, we had carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. So ribosomes are what are making those proteins within the cell. Okay, moving on to the Golgi body. This is what packages cell products for delivery using vesicles. You will hear the Golgi body referred to as the post office of the cell, because it does exactly what the post office does. It packages and it sends out. Now, here's the picture of the Golgi body, or sometimes you'll hear it referred to as the Golgi apparatus, but here is the Golgi body. Now, you may think, and it is easy to get the two, to confuse the Golgi body with the endoplasmic reticulum because they have similar shapes. Here's the differentiating factor between the two. The endoplasmic reticulum is attached to the nucleus. See how it's not a part of the nucleus, but it is attached. The Golgi body is completely separate. Okay, what it does, it packages products and then it transports. So it said that it transported things using vesicles. So what's a vesicle? Well, it's a membrane enclosed structure that's used to transport materials to the cells. So it's exactly how it sounds. It is the post, it's your mailman. That's essentially what the vesicle is. So if the Golgi body is the post office, if that's where things are packaged and gotten ready for delivery, then your post office or your mailman comes and picks it up and he delivers it, right? That's what the vesicle does. It's the mailman that goes to the Golgi and picks it up and delivers it to where it needs to go throughout the cell. So moving on to lysosomes. Lysosomes contain enzymes that break down wastes. So enzymes we spent quite a bit of time talking about. Those are something that speeds up the reaction in a cell. So enzymes or lysosomes contain enzymes that break down wastes. Sometimes you'll hear the word lyse in science. Oftentimes will be incorporated or be related to like cell death. And so, or I shouldn't say cell death, but just death in general. So when something is lysed, it's killed, okay? And so a lysosome breaks down wastes. These are rarely found in plant cells. So remember, with eukaryotic cells, we have plant and animal cells. Lysosomes are rarely going to be found in plant cells. They're 9 times out of 10 going to just be found in animal cells, which is something else that will allow you to differentiate between the two. So here's the lysosome here. And inside, it kind of gives you like a dissected image. Inside, it looks like it has these smaller balls, and those are the digestive enzymes that's breaking down the wastes. So it helps in the digestion of wastes in the cell. Okay, chloroplast. This is something else that is specific to a plant cell, okay? It is not found in an animal cell. It is only found in a plant cell. This is the site of photosynthesis to make sugars. So when the time comes this year, we are going to know the process of photosynthesis in detail. Same with cellular respiration. Those two are going to go hand in hand. Go ahead and get it now that photosynthesis takes place in the chloroplast of the plant cell. Okay? Now, notice right here is the chloroplast. It contains something called chlorophyll. And here we have several chloroplasts throughout the cell. Okay? Here's something that you need to recognize. Once again, you may think, okay, Ms. Brammer, that has a similar structure to the mitochondria or to the endoplasmic reticulum or to the Golgi complex. It has kind of like that folded look. That is true, but a chloroplast will always be green. And here's why. Because it contains chlorophyll. Chlorophyll has a green color, and so because it contains chlorophyll, the chloroplast will always be green. So when you are looking at a plant cell, you're going to know it's a plant cell because it has a cell wall, but because it also has a green chloroplast in it. Okay, an animal cell is not going to have that. So now we have a vacuole. A vacuole is something that stores food, water, and wastes. Both plant and animal cells have it. The vacuole is just going to be much larger in a plant cell. And this is the vacuole right here. I mean, it's massive, right? So that's another differentiation between plant and animal cells is the size of the vacuole. But it's what stores food, water, and wastes. So there's something called the centrioles. They may be referred to as a centrosome. They kind of look like these rod structures here, and they help animal cells during cell division. So once again, we are going to talk in depth about cell division later. I don't know if y'all have heard the terms mitosis, but we are going to learn the ins and outs of mitosis, and the centrioles play a huge role in mitosis and the cell division. So I have kind of talked through these major differences in plant and animal cells as we have gone through, but just to reiterate, the major differences in plant and animal cells are that plant cells have cell walls and chloroplasts. Okay, those are two structures that animal cells do not have. Remember, chloroplasts are always going to be green. Why is that? Because they have chlorophyll in them. Now, moving on to the vacuole, both have it. Both plant and animal cells have a vacuole. However, animal cells have small vacuoles and plants have very large vacuoles. So that's something else. It's another major difference between the two. So cell walls, because plant cells have cell walls, it gives the plant cell a more definite shape. It's not always square or rectangle, but it's more rigid. Remember, we talked last week about the plasma membrane. And remember, the big thing about the plasma membrane is that it had fluidity, right? It's even known as a fluid mosaic model because it's just all these components suspended in a liquid. Well, with that, we are able to have different shapes, and it's able to take shape in different ways because all it has is that cell membrane that has fluidity. Versus an animal cell that has a cell wall, that's something that's more rigid. Remember, it's made of cellulose. Cellulose is a sugar, it's a carbohydrate, so it has that tougher structure, and that's what results in the more rigid shape of plant and animal cells. So here's the picture comparing the two. So let's look at that. Animal cells here on the right, plant cells here on the left. Right off the bat, let's look at the fact that this has a cell wall. Okay, this one does not. This just has a cell membrane. And notice the cell wall leads to a different shape. See how this one has a more rigid shape? It's like every side is straight. Versus with an animal cell, it kind of looks more rippled, right? There's less of a definite shape. Here we have the vacuole. Look how big the vacuole is, right? It doesn't even have the vacuole labeled in the animal cell because it's so small. Versus the vacuole here takes up nearly half of the cell. We also have the chloroplast, right? That's only found in the plant cell. Notice that it's green. Remember, it's always going to be green because of the chlorophyll. So now that we've covered all the organelles, you're going to need to be familiar with them. I'm not asking you to know every single step of the process that each organelle does, but I need you to have a general overview of their function, okay? So be sure that you review these notes. You're going to have a worksheet later on this week covering the different functions of the organelles. You need to know them. Okay, I can't stress that enough. You need to know the organelles. You need to know the difference between the plant and animal cells. Okay, so be sure that you're familiarizing yourself with this concept. If you have issues, please, please, please reach out to me. Let me schedule a Google Meet with you. Let me explain it further to you, because the cell is so small, but the processes of the cell leads to every other function in our body. Okay, so we are starting here. We are laying the foundation for every other concept that we are going to talk about this year. So I need you to make sure that you're understanding the parts of the cell and the functions of the cell before you're going to be able to get what we're going to learn next.